can't do that.
Okay, we're live. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Welcome to the Jay's 72nd Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Suzanne Simon, and I'm co-chair of Detroit Jewish Book Fair Steering Committee. Book Fair is proudly sponsored by the Jay, where you can find your Jewish center. Book Fair would like to thank all of its patrons and sponsors for their support. Thanks to all of our generous donors who are able to present our programs free of charge, and we invite you to become a patron or sponsor as well. We'd also like to thank, of course, Schuler Books, our community bookseller for 2003, and especially extend our gratitude to the entire Book Fair committee. Your dedication and efforts have made all of this possible. We have a dynamic lineup of fabulous authors and programs that you will not want to miss. Please visit our website at jccdet.org/bookfair for more information. Please also visit our bookstore running throughout Book Fair at the J, and please shop our online bookstore where you will find more hand-selected books. bookshop.org/shop/Jewish Book Fair. Your purchases help to support this annual event and allow us to bring these wonderful authors to our community. We have a fascinating event for you today, and we want you to be part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube, the comment section below, or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many of your questions as they can. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way you'll never miss any of our exciting virtual events. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest. Lisa Scottoline is a New York Times #1 best-selling author and Edgar Award-winning author of 35 novels, including her latest work, Loyalty. Lisa has over 30 million copies of her books in print and is published in over 35 countries. She lives in the Philadelphia area with an array of disobedient pets, but she wouldn't have it any other way. Karen Tintori is an internationally best-selling author of fiction and nonfiction, whose novels, written with Jill Gregory, have been translated into more than 25 languages. There's Something Borrowed, Something Blue was excerpted in Cosmopolitan magazine and became a CBS TV Movie of the Week. A graduate of Wayne State University, she lives in Michigan with her husband and one of her sons.
Hi, Lisa. Here we are again.
Hello, Karen. It's wonderful to speak with you. And thanks to Suzanne and Lauren and the whole book fair for having me. I'm just super excited to be here and very, very honored, frankly.
We are so excited to have you back. And the Loyalty, your new book, is absolutely fantastic. I thought I had an idea what was going on with the Mafia in Sicily, and it was an absolute eye-opener for me. And I loved every minute of it.
Thank you so much.
So so people who are familiar with your work know that you are an attorney, and that all of your novels, you really concentrate on the play between law and justice and family. Family is central. And so whether it was the series with the female lawyers, the Rosatis and the D'Annunzios, and even what happened to the Bennetts, everything centers around that. Mm-hmm. So, and loyalty, being a loyal person. So would you talk a little bit about this theme that is so important to you?
Well, I think, and thank you for saying that. I think that's a really perfect description of my work. And I think in loyalty, what I really wanted to explore is that law doesn't always lead to justice, as we know. You know, we're said, if we go back in Perry Mason land, right, we thought law leads to justice. Then we started to think, well, law doesn't always lead to justice. But what I wanted to explore, and that's why I think I'm so grateful to be part of the Jewish Book Council's presentations, is that I like to look at the really horrifying effects of when law perpetrates injustice, because it's a direct kind of perversion of what is really supposed to happen. And unfortunately, throughout history, there are so many examples of when laws are enacted that are actually anti-Semitic. So it's actual discrimination under color of law. The one everyone can think of immediately is the Nuremberg laws. But what I learned is when I started to really explore the history of Sicily and the history of Sicily's law and justice system, it goes all the way back to the Spanish Inquisition, which you could believe, or, you know, you learn it in school and you go, when is that going to matter? Well, modern day Sicily has a very, very small Jewish population. In fact, the New York Times reported about 3 years ago, they couldn't even get a minyan in Palermo, the capital of Sicily. And that is actually because of what happened during the Spanish Inquisition and how Jews were expelled from Sicily. There were 40,000 Jews that were expelled on pain of death, were forced to convert, were forced into hiding. And it was really a horrifying but true example of how law, in the sense of the Spanish Inquisition, can lead to injustice. And I said, I want to write about that. And so much of that was woven into the fabric of Sicily so that it becomes a book about justice and about loyalty, not only in the sense of us to each other, but to a cause, to a religion, to a country, to a set of legal, a rubric, a way of how you live your life. So I hope all of that stuff is happening in the background, but I think that's sort of the angle that I think would be of interest to the people watching today.
Absolutely. After the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians in school, when I wanted to become an archaeologist, it's like history was like, it was not my favorite subject until I started reading historical novels. And that has been so enriching. And now you have embarked on, I mean, this is your second historical with an Italian and a Jewish theme. And both Eternal from last year or from 2 years ago and Loyalty really, really are excellent. I love both of them, and I learned so much from both of them.
Thank you.
And I know there are 4 central characters we follow in Loyalty. Mm-hmm. And were all of those actors present on the stage when you started? Did anybody pop in, or did you have those 4 intertwined stories from the beginning?
No, I mean, it's such a legitimate question. I write without an outline, which means that I'm in a state of anxiety completely. So I had nothing. But what I had was, and just to sort of give a little bit of background about me, I'm Italian American. I don't really have a religion. I was raised without a religion. And I learned more and more about Italian Jews during a course I had with Philip Roth at University of Penn undergrad, because he introduced us to Primo Levi's work, Survival in Auschwitz. And I never forgot it. And the more and more I learned about the plight of the Jews worldwide and how there's so much discrimination under color of law, that I thought the first example of that was, for me, that I wanted to write about, was World War II and fascism. That even though the Holocaust had been looked at from so many angles in fiction, it hadn't really been addressed in fiction in Italy since The Garden of the Finzi Continis, which was a wonderful novel, but was decades old. Right. And I also thought that the story of what happened in particular to the Jews of Rome and how the true facts of how the Nazis, the fascists first perpetrated these anti-Semitic laws, and the Nazis took advantage of that, was a story that really should be told. And that sort of led me to write Eternal. Now, Eternal was about 3 characters that all lived within a block, 2 blocks of each other, because they're city kids. And there's a lovely girl and 2 guys she has a crush on, one Jewish and one Gentile. The Gentile will turn out to be fascist. The Jewish kid turns out to be a math genius, and they all three are friends. And I wanted to explore that notion of complicity. In other words, as the kid becomes fascist, he has to start to turn a blind eye to what fascism is doing to his best friend who's Jewish.
Right.
Because I want to explore that gray area, because I think that's very relevant all the time. You know, are you racist if you tolerate racism? These kinds of questions, I think, kind of provoke discussion and thought. And I think all of my novels, even though they're stories, will provoke that. I think your comment is so apt, Karen, that history, the way they teach it to us sometimes, is a little dry. But when I started reading historical fiction decades ago, and then started writing it just more recently, it personifies history. What is it like to live in fascism as a Jew during 1940s Rome? What is it like to live in 1820s Sicily as a Jew and have to go into hiding? What does that actually feel like? And Sicily, in answer to your question, these characters came to me partly in contrast to Eternal, because although Eternal takes place in a city that the kids all know each other, I do research, enormous amount of research. And I went to Sicily to research it. And I realized how vast a country it is and how different the terrain, particularly in the 1800s. They weren't connected. So Palermo, where the Mafia was born, was different from the mountaintop towns like Musomeli, where my character who's Jewish, Alfredo, hides out, or the fishing towns where one other character, a woman, is expelled. So it ends up being a novel of outsiders. And the task was, how will they come together? How will they operate on each other? And will they solve this central problem, which happens in the beginning of the novel, which is that there's a boy kidnapped. And Sicily at the time is completely lawless, as you correctly point out. It was colonized by Greeks and Romans and everybody. All of the laws favor the colonizers, not the colonized. And so essentially it becomes a place where it's a free-for-all and gives rise to the mafia. But also, if you're a kid kidnapped in that, what happens to you? Who rescues you? Will this kid who's kidnapped at the beginning of the novel get rescued, and by whom? By all of these four characters, or by one, or how will that work? And that was my kind of journey through the novel. And I think it becomes the reader's journey through the novel. I hope it's entertaining and suspenseful, but obviously for our present purposes, also educational.
Absolutely. I mean, when you read a historical novel, you're living through the characters that time period. It's not
exactly
just a bunch of facts in a book. And I think you did a phenomenal job of presenting that. And there was a play between light and darkness throughout the whole book. And I especially, when we met Lucia, and between Lucia and Dante, and I love that. And I don't know if that was intentional or if that just happened.
As a novelist, you would pick that right up. I had fun. I entertained myself. I did. And I think, because when you're writing about dark times, you can't deny that they exist. And part of the story of the characters in Loyalty and in Eternal, and the Jews themselves, frankly, is of survival. I think at the end of Eternal, there's a character who's left, Maria, and she says, she's looking at a table and she has to give a toast, and she's never done that. She's very plain spoken, but people have died. And she looks at a table and she sees the empty seats. I feel that. As those of us who are older, we feel that all the time. And she says, when I look at this table at the wedding, I see the seats who are empty. And it reminds me of when I go to my cupboard at night and I want to make dinner, and I have to make dinner, but I don't have all the ingredients I need. I'm very mindful there are some who are missing, but at the same time, I have to put a meal on the table. And so I ask myself, what can I make with what I have? And I thought that's interesting, because you're always if you're writing, you're trying to make an analogy that illustrates something about the character. She's going to pick an analogy that is within her frame of reference. That would be, she's a homemaker. She's a mom and a wife. She has to make a dinner. And when you say to yourself, what can I make with what I have? I realized that was sort of the really very homespun and humble way to look at the question of, how do I survive this? Whether this is really impossible times, or World War or chemo or COVID or all of the hardships. I think women in particular, we ask ourselves as the glue in the families kind of sometimes, what do we do to put food on the table? What can we do with what we have? And that's why I feel like there is that light in the darkness in my books. And I look for that and I write for that.
Well, also there was the interplay between good and evil with the twin brothers. And then I'll get back to and surviving. Everybody in the book in one way or another is fighting to survive.
Right. And it's interesting because, as someone interested in justice, as I think most people are, because I was a law professor in my time. And, when you think about this justice question, you don't need a law degree. And it's sort of an amalgam of what is right and wrong, what is illegal and legal, what is moral and what is immoral. It's a kind of a bolus of all of these questions. And the Mafia for me raises that, because as an Italian American, I'm kind of embarrassed that I had to ask myself, why did it begin in Sicily? Is there something about Italians that lends itself to criminality? I mean, obviously we hope that's not the answer, but I started to explore the economic issues that gave rise to that criminality. And you begin to understand the sources of crime writ large that aren't necessarily tied to any race or people or DNA, but really have to do with these, what you hope being American fixes: equality, inclusivity, justice for all. All of those notions that we experiment on in this country are the kind of thing that, if they're like the rule of law fulfills its promise and gets justice, there is pursuit of happiness. There is all of these things, and there is really equality for people, and not discrimination or hate or violence. That's really what I want to deal with in these themes. And I think I write books for smart people, and I think smart people get it.
Well, when I was very surprised about the start of the Mafia and the lemon groves, because when I was doing research on a book about my Sicilian family, I was trying to understand why this horrible thing happened in my family, and went back and looked at the history of the peasants in Sicily, which, as you said, had the footprint of so many cultures. It's at the crossroads between Africa and Europe. And it was conquered by everybody. The peasants were beaten down. There was that feudal system where the landlords owned the land.
Right.
I mean, at one point, the farmers had to buy their seed at a high price and then sell what they grew at a low price. So they got shafted at both ends of the deal. And so I had thought always that it was this Robin Hood, that they were banding together against the feudal. And then after the feudalism was over, the church took over, and they were the landowners. And that's why a lot of the Italian Catholics who emigrated here were like anti-church. So can you tell us a little bit about, without spoiling anything, about the lemon groves? Just blew my mind.
I know, it's fascinating, and I really, it's rock solid research, and it's interesting to me because I think that Robin Hood stuff is a myth. That whether the Mafia perpetrates or popular culture perpetrates, but the answer is something you learned in 6th grade, which is scurvy. Like sailors who were on board British ships got scurvy, and they discovered that lemons cure scurvy. Okay, well then what happens is Palermo, because it was actually irrigated by the Arabs. And by the way, Jews flourished under Arab rule. It was actually under Catholic rule that everything went horrific. And there was discrimination. It's very interesting. And so the lemons become so valuable that the lemons need to be guarded. And by the way, you're completely correct about your sketch of the history and the colonization. And it was a feudal structure. And so what happens is all these barons who own the land, by the way, that it's feudal means you can't buy it. You can't buy land. Only blue-blooded noble people can buy land. Right. And peasants in Sicily were virtually enslaved. My family is not from Sicily, but southern Italy, and it suffers from the same kind of illiteracy, grinding poverty. And and oppression by law. So when the lemon becomes very, very valuable, they need guards. So then the noblemen hire guards to guard the lemons. And at some point, these guards figure, well, wait a minute, we can basically extort the barons to give us money so that they're guarding the lemons from themselves. And it's actually the first protection racket in the world.
Right.
And that's just, to me, it's fascinating, but it also shows you that when there is inequality of opportunity, there is not upward mobility. That's part of our great American experiment. You know, that when you deny and oppress people like that, like happened in Sicily, they find a workaround and it's not going to be lawful. So that's what happened in Sicily. And it was fascinating to me. And sort of the untold story of the Mafia, as much as we love Mafia movies and all that stuff, and I do love it, I thought it was really interesting to understand how it came about. And
Well,
it's effect on people.
Interesting that in The Godfather, it wasn't a lemon grove, it was an orange grove. Shouldn't they?
Yeah.
If they had done their homework, they would have used lemons.
Come on, guys, just ask me.
Yeah, yes, right. So you want to talk about the twin brothers and the conflict, the different conflicts that you've got?
Well, I think
good and evil.
I think in loyalty, and I mean, I've written 35 books. I think, and you know this from the many books you've written, character to me is the most important thing. I mean, I'm a people person, even though I live alone and I kind of miss people. If it weren't for my book tour, I wouldn't go out much. But Karen, you know, I remember you. I've read you. You know, it's the people in our lives we remember. I'm a single mom. I have a daughter. She's everything. I have dogs, but that's not the point. The point is that when I'm writing, you know, when I'm trying to explore what is the nature of evil, and it's almost like what happened in Eternal. What makes somebody become a fascist? What makes somebody oppress someone else? What makes somebody enact laws that will oppress people, an entire religion, an entire culture? Who, you know, and it was Primo Levi who had this incredible quote, which I never forgot, and it inspired me for loyalty and for Eternal. And I saw he said it in a tape that I watched, and I could never find it again, but I'll paraphrase his quote. Now, he survived Auschwitz, and he was an Italian Jewish chemist who wrote the incredible memoir, Survival in Auschwitz. And of course, being Italian, he looks at it as only an Italian can. He actually describes Auschwitz as Dante's Inferno, the levels of hell of Dante's Inferno, because Italians raised in Italy are imbued with Dante. And it's so fascinating, right? Vis-a-vis people and what fleshes out an identity. Only an Italian is going to be in that camp and look at it like that. In fact, there's a very moving scene, and it's completely nonfiction, of course, where he describes Inferno to the guard. In any event, so when you're looking at what makes somebody evil, one of the things Primo Levi said, he said, as soon as you see somebody as different from you, you will see them as other than you. And if you see them as other than you, you will see them as less than you. And in the end, there is a camp. That just blew me away, honestly, because I think it's chilling. And it is the perfect articulation of, I think, what happens when hate takes hold and discrimination takes hold. Now, you and I, as novelists, and everybody listening is people who love books, you know, I think readers have more empathy than anybody. And I'm not sure that if they get it, and because they're so empathic, they read. But I know that they get it from reading. Because as you say, you learn what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes. Like in To Kill a Mockingbird, you know, Atticus says to Scout, you need to understand somebody, you need to walk in their shoes. That's just an articulation of what is empathy. And to me, when you really understand what it's like to be somebody else, you don't see them as other. Novelists, our job is to find the commonalities, not just, oh, I like this character because he feels like me or she feels like me. There's a woman in the book who's a single mother. She gives birth to a child who has albinism, which at that time was unheard of. There were no cases of albinism, or what we call crassly an albino. We don't use that term anymore, but And it was interesting in Sicily because, as you point out, Sicily is actually closer to Africa than it is to Rome. So when you go to Sicily, you see African Americans. And so what happens is that, especially in the 1800s, there was a significant Black population, or a population that was people of color. So that you can imagine a young woman who has a child, by sheer mutation, the child has albinism. She has a very white baby in a very Black culture. I thought that was very interesting vis-a-vis the point you're making earlier about lightness and darkness and what are these values. And so the point is this, though, that my job is to create these characters, understand where they come from, and find the commonalities with modern day people. And I thought, she's like a single mother. I've been a single mother my whole life. I know exactly what it's like to feel like you're on your own. I was broke for 10 years till I got published. And it was just me and my daughter on our own. I might as well have been expelled from the village. I felt like I was expelled from the village. And that's a feeling we all have had from time to time when our life goes a little awry or off kilter. You kind of don't know what's coming around the bend in life. And I want to explore those commonalities because I think they end up, not only do they make for successful fiction and that people can relate to it, but ultimately the purpose of the arts writ large, Karen, we've talked about this before, is to make people understand how similar they are. I've loved doing the JCC things, and I've done hundreds of them at this point. But sometimes people will say, in fact, often people will say, you're not Jewish. Why do you care? And the answer, I'm just being frank with you, you don't have to be Jewish to care about what happens to Jews. If that's you have to be human, right? I'm sure there's plenty of people listening now who aren't Black but care about what happens to Black people. It's the same thing. People who have empathy understand this. And it is important that we understand it more and more. So we have to tell our history, not only in what happened to the Jews of Sicily and what happened to the Jews of Rome, but all the stories that are being told in this book fair, the stories you tell as well. The more we understand that and personify history, like you were saying, the more we understand the commonalities, and the happier we will all be.
Right.
I think.
Right. Well, they say that travel broadens, travel would give you that empathy, meeting people from other cultures and visiting other places. But not everybody can travel, but they can travel through books. And that's our job, is to bring them to places. I had just read a quote recently that says, books take you to places you never knew you needed to go. And I really like that.
That's a really good quote.
Yeah. I don't know to whom to accredit that, but anyway, yes. I got a really big kick out of Alfredo's daughters.
Oh.
and I'm like, oh yes. Are those the names of your little
my dogs?
Yeah.
I guess we should.
Didn't you have some sheep or some goats at one time?
I do. I live on a farm now, and so I live alone, except for 3 dogs and a cat and a pony, and I have some chickens up there. I'm looking up at the barn. But I think a little bit. And for Alfredo, and he's a Jewish character who's forced so cruelly into hiding, because he's afraid he can't, and it's really obviously impossible to practice your religion without a Torah and a rabbi and kosher meat and all the things he wants, but he can't do that. And this actually happened during the time that these Jews who stayed behind after the Inquisition, generations, were called Moranos, which was a Spanish derogatory term, or conversos, and they had to act like they were Gentiles. So they would go to church. They had to keep up a good front. They were terrified of the truth being found out. He's terrified. And to me, I kind of wanted to personify sort of what it's like, as I did in Eternal, but really this is such an extreme case that he is so, as you said, he is so isolated because of the secret he must keep on pain of death, and how it keeps him separate from people who he's afraid they're going to kill him. And that's not an invalid fear. So but at the same time, I do think, especially as a person like me who, listen, I'm divorced twice. I'm kind of on my own for a long time. Not everybody's lucky enough to be married, and there's plenty of widows and widowers and divorced people and who find themselves living alone. And you go, well, how do you make yourself happy? Well, you get a dog And that's why I think I have so many pets. Nobody can stop me. I kind of feel so lucky, honestly. I love books. I love writing them. I'm so grateful to my readers and for interviews like this and really conversations like this. But like a lot of people, my dogs are really important to me and their family. So when my daughter comes home, all of our conversation, if it's not about what we're reading or what we're watching on Netflix, it's always about what the dogs are thinking. Like we're sitting around going, oh, she wants this. She wants to go out. She wants a treat. And so I wanted Alfredo to be a guy who lives alone, but he makes himself happy through these. His wife has passed, but he makes himself happy by his goats. He makes goat cheese and he loves his goats like they're his daughters and he protects them with his life. And I like to explore that too. The relationship of people to animals. For example, I'm pretty old now, but I remember a time when, people had one dog, like that was their dog. And then people started getting more dogs and then people started getting more cats. And then all of a sudden, I remember a long time, if your dog died, you'd be like, well, it's just a dog. But you're really sad. Now people know that that's not very enlightened. And in a way, it is almost the same principle as the othering that, believe it or not, Primo Levi was talking about. Are you other if you're a different species? Where is the commonality? I have a dog family in my house. I have a mother and two sons. Let me tell you, they relate. They relate like a family. And it's funny and it's real. And it resonates for me. So I wanted that for Alfredo. His goats are what make him so happy. But at the same time, it takes the village with its, this Sicily is so imbued. And I think this happens in a lot of cultures with suspicions that are sort of quasi-religious and knock on wood. And, these suspicions that begin to surround him that begin to encroach on the secret he is keeping, which is his Jewishness.
Right.
And threaten his very life. And I won't give anything away, but I love what he does and how he survives. But certainly his family is composed of some furry creatures, and I kind of identify with that.
Well, at the beginning of Loyalty, there's the cast of characters.
Right.
From my families. So I'm reading about him with his daughters. And then when I get to the daughters, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Daughters. I love that.
I didn't know if I could do that because I was like, I don't know if this is kosher because a little bit like the daughters are goats. But then I was like, he thinks of them as his daughters. So go, like no one tells me, no one tells me what to do anymore. When women get hit a certain age, they stop asking permission. I'm almost there. Right. So I'm going to do it that way. And I thought, that is in keeping with who he is in his heart.
Well, I loved Gaetano, the attorney, and the conflict that man went through, and even within his family, the conflict that he went through. And I was very interested in the secret society, the Beati Poli.
I know.
I didn't know anything about that. That was fascinating.
I didn't either. When I went to Sicily is where I'd read something about, and I thought, is this real or is this kind of apocryphal or kind of BS? But it turns out it was real. And it's what it is now we've talked about the fact that Sicily is lawless. So imagine a lawyer and there he is, and he's a good-hearted guy. And what happens is there were spates of kidnappings, right? What was happening was people were kidnapping the children of noblemen for money. And it was the typical kidnapping at the time wasn't like it is on any of the crime shows. Oh, the golden hour in 24 hours, it's resolved. These were kidnappings that went on right for like 5 years. And the mafia is sending back body parts and they're raising these kids in this horror. And nobody comes to save them because the police are completely corrupt and maybe in league with the kidnappers. But there happened to be in Sicily in the 1800s a real group of noblemen who cared about justice, unlike the law that did not care about justice. That's what I love about this notion that anybody can care about justice. And so they met in a church basement. They called themselves the Blessed Society of St. Paul. They really revered St. Paul. Now, I had to learn all about St. Paul because I didn't have any religion, so I wasn't raised with it. And St. Paul was interesting because he's the one that said, fight the good fight. And his credo was kind of do every act with love. And I thought that's a pretty good credo. And I also like the idea, and I explored it in Eternal too, that when you think about law and you think about religion, even the 10 Commandments, these are ways of, I think of it as a rubric. It's sort of a framework, a way to live your life that is moral. And in opposition to violence, right? We don't want to resolve our disputes by hurting each other. We want to resolve them by talking about it, by having a legal system that will say, well, this is your rights and this is your rights, and you have to coexist in some way. And if the law isn't going to give that to you, what was happening in Sicily, because the law wasn't giving it, was that I think the Blessed Society of St. Paul was formed because people were getting it from the religion. And indeed they do. Whether your religion is Judaism or Catholicism or Islam, you have a way of behaving that you are taught is how civilized people behave in society. And so I was really interested to look at that and to see the conflict that Gaetano has, because Gaetano really steps into the feet of the police, and he's going to try to find out how to save this kidnapped kid. At the same time that, for example, he comes into the beginning of the kid is stowed on a so-called lunatic asylum, which really existed, which I visited. And by the way, if people are interested, these are all, I filmed it. So it's all on my website. You can see it. It's a nice companion to the novel. But you find out, when I learned when I was there, Karen, that God bless Sicily, because it was the beginning of modern psychiatry.
Yes.
Right?
That was fascinating.
It's fascinating. Here's this incredibly backward place, right? No one's educated except for the nobles, and there are very few of them relative to the rest of Europe. But what happened was there was a real actual person. His name was Baron Pisani, and he was just a guy, a nobleman, had some training in archaeology and even in law, but had a son that he loved very much who was 16, Antonio, and the boy died. And they used to play music together, and they shared music. And the Baron felt himself go into a deep depression. Then it was called melancholia, and he couldn't get himself out of it, except that he began to listen to more and more music. And then he would go to choral shows, and then he would look at art, and then he would look at painting, and he felt that he cured himself through the arts. And so when he went to the actual lunatic asylum, it was called the Royal Madhouse of Palermo.
Yeah.
Where this fictional child is being held. It's a horror show. It's a former convent. It's also a leper colony. So lunatics, so-called lunatics, are housed there. Also people with tuberculosis, and also the mentally ill, the depressed. They're just chained to a wall. It's as horrific and gothic as you can imagine, but it really happened. And this one man says, this cannot be. This is immoral. It's inhumane. It doesn't comport with my system of morality, which, by the way, wasn't attached to any religion or any law. It was attached to a moral code. What is right and what is wrong? And he got all his rich guy friends, and they all collected money. And he said, I'm going to give art therapy. He invented it. Yeah. To these people. He took them off the wall. He washed them up. He said, you are people. You're human beings. There's a lot in loyalty about what is a monster. They call him a monster. What I'm trying to explore, what is it that makes a human being human? And so Baron Pisani totally changes. These people start to become cured. Their depression lifts. He brings in pianists. He brings in violinists. He teaches them to paint. They rebuild themselves. The whole asylum, which stands today, sadly in ruin. Palermo cannot afford to make it into the museum that really deserves to be. But I thought even that was sort of another example of light in darkness. That here's an individual, right, who just decides this is wrong. I am going to do something about it. And sadly, just to tell the sad story ending of his life, Baron Pisani enacts all these changes. By the way, people come from the world over to see it, including Edgar Allan Poe, Booker T. Washington. It becomes world famous in psychiatry and in the world. And when there is an outbreak of cholera, I think it was in the 1830s, 1832 in Sicily, it infects the patients in the asylum. and he will not leave them. He is so loyal to them, and he dies with them, dedicated to them. And I thought that is a real point of light in a real darkness, and sort of a little tribute to the power of one person to enact change in the face of.
I just got chills, but it's really true.
It's really true.
This scene where people who have been, I don't know what they look like, hermits, whatever, who hadn't been shaved, hadn't had their hair cut, had lice, had matted hair, whatever. When they're cleaned up and they see themselves, that struck me. It reminded me of videos you see of some of the unhomed people who are on the streets, and somebody comes up and says, let me give you a haircut, let me give you a shave, and the transformation. And I loved reading about him. Like it's true. Ripples in a pond. One, you say, what can I do? Yeah, one human being can do so much. And I mean, your novels don't just tell a story. They are so broad and uplifting, and really a moral code is in all of them. And I so appreciate it.
Well, that's so kind of you. And that analogy to unhoused people is that shows how much empathy you have. Because I hadn't even thought of that, but it really is like that. It's like, there is a person here, and they're a human being. And that's what he saw. And that's what I think people with empathy see when we look at each other. And as soon as you see that, it changes how you treat somebody.
When you talked about my background is half Sicilian, half my family is from Sicily, 2 areas, Palermo, Corleone, and then also on the west coast, Mazzara del Vallo, and the other half came from near Bologna, from the mountains near Bologna. And
just there,
the DNA keeps changing.
Right.
And I just found that I have 0.9% Nigerian. Right. I have Jewish DNA, both Ashkenazi and Sephardic, about 8%. But it was like, I was expecting that, because if you see pictures of my grandfather, he looked like he was an African American. So
right.
Yeah, if only people realized. Well, some of these genealogy shows where they
love that.
Find out who your ancestors are. If only people realized our humanity, and that we're all a mix of everything, and that that like you mentioned, like people look at the other, and everybody becomes into tribes, and you're not in my tribe, and starting with Cain and Abel. So and then you've got the twin brothers here who are on both sides of the mafia, not the mafia, good and evil, which is kind of Cain and Abelish.
Well, I kind of wanted to explore that family dynamic of, because you still have that stuff, and I'm interested in that stuff. So here's 2 guys, they're twin brothers who grow up in a family, and the mother favors one and the father favors the other. And there's one who's born like 2 minutes earlier, and he thinks he just is so alpha. And for a while it works, but I love how things change. And maybe this is also the perspective of aging, and it happens with friends, it happens in workplaces where the power dynamic shifts, that maybe your little brother is okay, bring a little brother for a while, but at some point he gets to go, hey, what's the deal here? When are you going to start respecting me? And this guy who for so long, the alpha one, he starts to think, I am better. I matter more than you. Now, when does that shade into, I don't know, that's sort of, we would call that entitlement today. I mean, I'm in the deli line and I see somebody push in front of me, and she thinks she matters more. And I can't always go, hey, I was here. I'm not really good at that. But I'm such a wimp sometimes. I'm like, just let her get it. Life is short. That's my father. My father's like, don't make a fuss. Not a big deal. My mother would have been like, cut her off at the knees, There's a character in this book that's a lot like my mother. I love my mother so much, but she was feisty. And so I really wanted to play with that family dynamic and see how it shifts, because it ends up being an exploration of, well, one guy's going to turn evil and one guy's a little evil. Where do they draw the lines? Because they draw the lines differently. One will murder, one will, where will they do that? And it's, again, that issue of gray areas and complicity. Is it really one more moral than the other? Not really, but they certainly start out that way, and then they morph and change. Somebody had to be the first mafia family, and somebody had to be really ruthless. And when the mafia early on was in Sicily, well, even today, they were really ruthless. And they didn't, as you said, the myth was Robin Hood. They oppressed the peasants and they exploited the noble people. They were for themselves. They were not for anybody but themselves.
Right.
It's ugly, but it's true.
Now, did you have both brothers in the beginning, or did the twin? Because I have to have a whole plot. I can't. It's like I went like this when you said you're a pantser. Oh my God, I don't know where I would be without having. I deviate from the outline. New surprises happen. But were they always twins, or did that come to you as you were writing?
Right, and we should explain that term you just used because I love that term. It's pantser, right? How would you explain it? Like.
You go by the seat of your pants. You start out with an idea and you just go and you just start writing and you know, every day is a new adventure. And with me, I've got a whole outline. And then this last book that I'm working on now, for the first time, I used index cards. I never do that. I just write a synopsis. But this time it was like, no, it's complicated. And so I was rearranging index cards. But
my daughter just wrote her first novel. She did that. And I have author friends. Half of us are crazy kamikaze, jump in, and the other half are very orderly. And I'm hoping to get remarried sometime. I need a date, but I'm going to marry a guy who doesn't outline. I need stability. I know. And you're right. You can deviate from it. I do think there's an impatience that I have. That's a flaw of mine. So I'm a little bit like, I don't want to figure it out now. I'll just figure it out when I get there. My daughter's like, you can't wing everything. You know, like we're going to go to Europe, but we're not going to have hotels the whole way. She's like, Ma, that's why we were talking earlier off screen about the difference between baking and cooking. Like, I'm a really good cook, but I'm a terrible baker, right? There maybe outline people bake better than, I don't know.
No, because I'm better at cooking than baking. Because cooking you can improvise. Baking is a science, you cannot improvise.
Right. I don't know if there's a correlation at all, but I don't, and I wish I could be an outline person because I do have a fair amount of anxiety when I'm writing. My question every day, and for people who are writing, we should say, I think it's good that you and I taken together can suggest to them there's no right way to do it. And I encourage everybody to write. Right. Just tell your story, tell your family story, write it down because I want the kids to read it. Like the stuff people live through. I mean, who would even believe COVID if you hadn't written that down, you know?
Right.
You're putting fantastic on your cereal boxes as they come in the door. I mean, anything, tell the story, tell it to yourself. And you can do it with an outline if you prefer or without it. And however you want to do it, what works for you. I do sometimes wish I had an outline, but if you don't have an outline, the way I do it is every day I go, what would this character do next? And what would the people around him or her do next? And we affect each other, you know, so how would that affect you? I knew we were going to talk at Karen. I took my shower. We got to talk a little. We affect each other. And then we come on. That's what I love about people. We need each other a little bit.
We need each other's energy. We
do.
Writers are we write, take a year to write a book. I've taken longer. But you're home, it's a solitary profession. And then, so you take a year to write a book, and then a reader, you know, I read it in 2 days. I stayed up all night and read it. And you're like, oh, wow. But you need that feedback. But no, we need energy from each other. People need energy from each other.
People need each other. People who need people.
That was like with COVID when they shut us all away from each other. It was, I had saved it for the longest time, and then T-Mobile erased it. It was my granddaughter. I don't know what she was, 8 years old at the time, or 7. And she called, you know, my son finally said, you're not just going to pull up in the driveway and wave from the car. You're going to come and give our kids a hug. And she's, Noni, I heard you're coming for a hug tomorrow. I'm so excited. And it was just, but anyway, I don't have it anymore.
Yeah.
We have a question.
Okay.
The question is, they want to know what you're working on next, Lisa.
Well, I am just doing copy edits of a book that is coming out in March called The Truth About the Devlins, because in addition to the historical fiction that I've been writing, I'm sort of a thriller person. I was president of Mystery Writers of America. I'm like that. I love crime and justice.
Right.
I really think of it as justice books, not like even crime books. And family, as you pointed out. So I wrote a book last year called What Happened to the Bennetts. And I sort of love looking at how family gets impacted by crime. So I haven't even spoken about this book yet, but I mean, the headline is it's about a family of lawyers and two brothers again, and a black sheep in the family. And maybe it is a little more dark and light, probably is. Sometimes that happens to you, Karen, where you realize what you're interested in when in retrospect, you're like, oh my God, maybe you're writing about this. Maybe that's what you're interested in. And you didn't really know it going in, which just sounds weird and kind of BS-y, but really isn't.
Right.
So it's a story about a family business, because I think that, and they're all lawyers, and then something bad happens, a crime, which I won't divulge, but sort of like something about the nature of family business is interesting. I am a family business, but how does that change the analysis when you're the black sheep and you almost ruin the business? I mean, you love your family, but you could do them wrong in a way that is different from the fact from a family that is not in business together. There are so many family businesses in America. And this is a very prosperous family, but they're going to come into some trouble. And I wanted to see how that crime gets resolved and how the family dynamics change. And does the family even survive? Because God knows we see things that, test our families every day.
Oh yeah. When one black sheep can bring a whole family down, and
right. Or one bad event can be a fact, or God forbid, a crime of violence or illness. Marriages break up when a child's ill sometimes. And what are the stresses that real people deal with, and how did they come out of it in a really suspenseful story? That's what I'm really was hoping to do. And it's out in March.
It's interesting because we were just recommended to watch It Ain't Over about Yogi Berra, documentary on Netflix about Yogi Berra.
I haven't seen it.
One of his sons was also a major league baseball player who got into cocaine and got arrested. And so it was like, of the three sons, Yogi calls the son in and says, if you don't cut this out, I am no longer your father. The woman in the kitchen is no longer your mother. Those two brothers over there are no longer your brothers. So that black sheep had to clean up his act or lose his family.
Well, it's interesting because the guy in this book, the Devlins, he's an alcoholic. And so I kind of wanted to vis-a-vis addictions, because I think that's something that touches families. I think it's touched my family. And I wanted to explore, again, maybe it's partly an exercise in compassion and empathy, but also limit setting. You can't, how do families deal with that? We struggle with that. And to try to find the empathy for the person who might be really ruining the family and ruining the family business, but he's still blood and he's still someone you love. And that gut wrench that families deal with every day. I mean, you see it, poor Matthew Perry. I loved Friends. That was a great show. And bravo to him for being so open about his struggles with addiction and really trying to help other addicts, and how sadly has passed now. That's something that I wanted to explore, that gut wrench of what is that like in a family, and how can we come to deal with that in a family in a way that's compassionate, but also just. Justice and compassion are tough.
Right.
They're often in conflict, right?
Right. Lady Justice with the scales. And
exactly. What are the scales? How do we feel about the death penalty? We're angry. We want revenge. But on the other hand, we should have mercy. That's something that is part of the justice question. And I think book clubs and people who like books that make you think like that, as well as move you, the kind that you write and the kind that I hope I write, are always going to have that as a backdrop. At least that's what interests me the most.
Well, I would recommend to all you book club people out there that both Loyalty and Eternal are great. I mean, you've seen the discussion we just had. This is tip of the iceberg. But there are discussion questions for book clubs on Lisa's website. And on her website, I'm going to take a page from you and show my travels and my research, because
Right.
I didn't list all, when I did Unto the Daughters, I didn't list all of the research at the back, but I loved reading about the different books. You know, if you want to know more about Sicily and about what was going on at the time, and appreciate that you listed that, and recommend that people visit your website to get a glimpse in some of your travels.
Thank you for that. And I think you should do it, because what I found, and you know this as well, that people who love to read are kind of lifelong learners. So that when I only did it because I started to get email from people go, I liked this about your book, and so it sent me to this book. And I was like, well, I like to acknowledge the books that I use and rely on and recommend books. And so I often find myself, I mean, it's horrible, but if you're watching TV and you have your phone and they go, oh, what's that about? And I want to learn about it right then. I don't want to wait.
Right.
So I think it's right. You like that too. Like
my husband, we're watching a show. He's immediately looking things up. I'm like, oh my God.
That's how I am. I'm like, oh my God, that really happened. Look at this. And my daughter's like, will you shut up and just watch the show? No, I never shut up and I never just watch the show. But you're right. And I think it's a great thing also, because like people like you and me, it is a solitary profession, but I know you're a people person like me. And I like to feel close to my readers, and I want readers to feel close to me. So
right.
The more I show them about what makes a book, I hope it gets them closer to me, and I hope it gets them writing their own book, right? If we can do it, Karen, anybody can do it. It's not like it's rocket science.
Tell your family stories.
Yes.
I always tell people, if you write a page a day, double spaced, in a year, you'll have a whole book.
That's exactly right. Listen, you can pick whatever word count. Now I'm lucky I work, and that's basically all I do. So I have 2,000 words a day. But, my daughter does 500 words a day. And there's plenty of people who have real jobs and do fewer. The key is just keep working on it, because I do think your brain works on it when you're not acting. Do you feel like
totally.
Like you're like, oh my God, it's working.
Your subconscious is always at work. I usually wake up in the morning and I'm going like, okay, I'll remember this. No, I make myself get up and write it down, because I don't.
I dictate it into the phone. Exactly. And sometimes I lie there. I read Ursula Le Guin. I'm pronouncing her name wrong, but she was a wonderful author. And she said when she wakes up in the morning, and I do this now, because you're very fresh and a lot of stuff is in your brain. And sometimes I'll wake up with an idea for the book. Like, oh, this is what should happen. I just lie there. I don't reach for my phone, which is what I used to do, or reach for anything, or turn on the TV, because I like all the news shows. I'm like guilty of that. Just think for a minute and let your thoughts come and write them down. And it really is incredible how your brain overnight has given you stuff that you wouldn't have seen. Or go for a walk or take a shower. Do you ever do that?
Take a shower or get in the car and the windshield. When I wrote with my friend, when we wrote novels together, we'd be working on a thorny problem. We'd take a walk. It didn't come to us. I'd get in the car. It was half a block from her house. And I'm like, through the windshield, it just, so we, gifts from God.
Gifts from God.
Something I woke up with this morning that now I've forgotten, but when we're done talking, hopefully it'll come back to me later.
It'll come back.
Yeah. But so you are like me. If I'm writing about a location, I have to put feet on the ground.
Absolutely right.
And you just came back from more travels in Italy. Even though I was in Genoa in May, I'm jealous.
Right. I was traveling for the next book, but I haven't even talked to my editor about that yet. So I probably shouldn't tell you, even though I did in the green room, but we don't need to be, I think my boss should hear it first.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Lisa and Karen, because we had this wonderful conversation.
Go ahead, Sue. You're on.
Okay. I want to thank you so much. And thanks to all of you online for joining us. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, jccdet.org/bookfair for our full schedule and ways to get involved. We'll see you at our next event. Thank you.